hand on your heart, look up at the sky, smile and say, hey, I'm alive. Thanks for being alive with me today. Hello and welcome to Be Alive with Kate Manser. I am thrilled today to have Lisa Keefauver, a friend and personal role model of mine. And as always, we always start Be Alive with arriving and remembering that we are arriving and that we are alive today. So, Lisa, can you just welcome us into this gift that we've all gotten to wake up today?
Absolutely. What a pleasure. I'd love to invite everybody to arrive here, maybe today by placing your hand over your heart center and casting your gaze low and just becoming present to the gift of your breath and expressing some gratitude for this generous care that we can offer ourselves at any given moment by placing our hands over our heart, connecting with our breath that serves us, that allows us not only to survive, but to thrive. Gifting yourself love and gratitude for the breath you get to take in this moment.
Thank you, Lisa.
Yeah, of course.
Survive and thrive. Now I've got like survive and thrive energy going through all of my capillaries and veins. And if anybody knows about surviving and thriving, it's you. Lisa is a grief activist and has been for many years and now has many layers to that. Her wisdom on the topic of grief and loss are rooted in the decades that she spent first as a social worker, a narrative therapist in nonprofit work, and then she had a tragedy in which she lost her husband at 40 years old. This has obviously really shaped her life and her work. And of course, her grief advocacy. She has a top rated podcast called Grief is a Sneaky Bitch. She serves as an adjunct professor at the UT Austin. And she also has a very popular TED Talk, Why Knowing More About Grief Can Make It Suck Less. And I'm especially thrilled to welcome you today because we are celebrating multiple things. Number one, we're celebrating your upcoming book. Number two, I believe we're also celebrating a clear cancer scan. And with all of that, and I just want to welcome you with an open heart to Be Alive today.
I am so grateful to be alive today and to be here today with you. Our friendship has spanned many years now since you were a guest on my pod. And I just love what you're doing with this and this daily reminder, which for those of us who faced loss, I think remember how precious life is. And I certainly going through navigating cancer this last year was another kick in the pants reminder to appreciate every moment we're alive.
Yeah. Have you seen the movie Steel Magnolias?
Of course.
Dolly Parton. I've only seen it about 734 times. But Dolly has this great quote in it in the beginning of the film when she's welcoming her new hairstylist. And the hairstylist is talking about how her husband left her and took all the money. And then she's talking about Ruth Robaline, who owns the boarding house. And she says, yeah, Ruth Robaline, she's lost 2 husbands and then she had cancer. Her level of suffering's right up there with Elizabeth Taylor. And when I think of someone who's had a level of suffering right up there with Elizabeth Taylor, it's also Lisa Keefauver.
I mean, I'll be in Elizabeth Taylor company. Okay, yeah.
And I just want to ask, I think we come across people, we've all experienced trauma, tragedy, pain, right? It's just part of what goes with being alive. But when I come across someone like you who has gone through 2 of the things that I think people are most afraid of in losing a spouse, coming down with cancer. Honestly, I think if you were to ask people what the things that they're probably more afraid of, other than apparently public speaking, it would be those 2 things. And so of course, I want to know about how that has impacted your sense of dealing with grief as well as feeling alive. But I think one question I think we all secretly have when we meet an Elizabeth Taylor-esque person like you is, what is your opinion on why some people go through such capital T trauma even more? You've experienced these 2 really altering experiences. Why? Let's get woo-woo. Why do you think it happens to some people and not others?
Well, I appreciate all of that. And I started out my life in my teens with another big T, capital trauma, being assaulted. So I've had quite a few along the way. I think, to be honest, I don't spend a lot of time with why me or that things happen for a reason. I think because you know me now, by now, I don't really believe in the beauty or the benefit of it must have happened for a reason kind of language. And I think when I think about the various suffering that I've experienced and then the people that I've worked with and the friends in my life, I really think the opportunity, so not the reason it happened, but the opportunity that we can choose to take out of our suffering, you call those the AFGOs, is how do I, to the point of what you're doing, how do I want to be alive? What do I want to do with this time? How do I want to live in alignment with my values, my integrity? How do I want to show up for the world? I think the opportunity is also to help us start to have more compassion, that this is a human experience, that not everybody experienced the same combination of things that I experienced, but everybody, if you live long enough, is going to experience some combination of suffering. And so if you can turn towards that suffering and find an expanded sense of compassion, which is what I try to do. And that takes practice, by the way, because there are definitely been days when I've had the woe is me moments and how come it's only happening to me and all those things. Life is so much richer. And our connections with people are so much richer because we have this expanded sense of our place in a broader humanity.
Wow. So everyone listening, from someone who's experienced multiple, I mean, so much the suffering up there with Elizabeth Taylor, what
Yeah.
you said so beautifully was us to turn towards suffering and let it expand us. And can you explain the AFGO reference that you made?
So this is a saying that came to me when in the teens after I experienced surviving a rape and was going through non-trauma informed therapy because this was the 80s, which is part of what led me to become a therapist myself, was the dearth of appropriate support, holding space support. But my mom said to me in this approach to think about like, what are the lessons we can learn in the wake of suffering? She said, ask yourself when you're ready, after you've woe is me'd and you've come to fall onto your knees and bow down to the weight of and the gravity of what has happened, is this is another fucking growth opportunity. That's what AFGO stands for.
Mhm.
Not
Well,
another fucking, it's tattooed on my body, one of the many tattoos on my body. And it's a reminder. Now, I want to preface whenever I say AFGO in our culture that has such a problem with toxic positivity and that we have to find resiliency and a reason for everything and that kind of bullshit, frankly, pressure
mhm.
to sort of move quickly through to some happy, shiny place. I always remind people, and I remind myself, is that we can't AFGO our way out of feeling of sitting in the suck. We have to be in the hard. We have to be with the suffering. It's just an invitation that at some point along the way, how might we ask ourselves, what is the growth opportunity here? So like, what is it that I can choose to learn? It might just be spending more time with family or caring about my health more, or it might be shifting careers. It might be little or big things, but AFGO is just a prompt that we can invite ourselves to be with so that we can start to metabolize the suffering that we experienced into something. We say often in grief, there's one of the many grief myths that I'm trying to combat in my work as a grief activist is that we try to make meaning of the death, meaning like everything happened for a reason. And really what we're trying to do through all of the losses and the suffering that we experience is to over and over again, keep turning our gaze towards what happened, learn something, that AFGO, and then find our meaning in our life. We want to find meaning in life. And to do that, you have to sort of turn towards your suffering and then ask yourself that very honest question, like, what is the AFGO here?
So it sounds like there's a certain amount of finesse in keeping that AFGO in our awareness, but you speak really clearly about sitting in the suck, being in the dark night of the soul. So how do you know how long you've been in the suck and how long to lay on the kitchen floor with the tear-stained face, plate of brownies just an arm's length away? How do you know how long
Yeah.
to stay in that? Because I've had a really hard year in 2022. I was so depressed. And now in hindsight, I can see that I was creating my own misery. I didn't have really trauma. I was just, my brain was pegged on negative thinking. And I had a coach at the time who said, I was crying. I was just telling her, oh, I don't know how
Yeah.
everything's horrible. And she said, she's from Eastern Europe. And she said, can I tell you something? And I said, yes, please tell me. You sound like a victim. And she told me straight up, and it was 100% true. And so that popped me out of Dark Night of the Soul into oh, okay, now it's time to put my big girl pants on. And move forward into the meaning making and redoing my life and fixing my broken thought
Yeah.
patterns. But how do you know how long
Yeah.
to be in the suck before you transition to the meaning making?
Thank you for sharing that with us. And I always want to like honor people who are willing to share their vulnerability because that's where the lessons come from for all of us, right? That's that understanding that there's a common humanity, that I'm not the only one suffering. And I also want to point out what you just said because maybe your listeners have had said the same things to themselves. Our negativity bias, as you said, looking for all the things that are going wrong in our lives, is neurophysiologically wired in us. So, in some ways, while I want us to be on the lookout for those negative loops, and that's part of what I do when I work with individuals, that's what I do for my own self. I try to be a should detective. That's what I call it, right? And for the negative loops. But that's neurobiologically wired, which means two things. One, we can have some grace and permission for ourselves that we get into those loops. Like, of course we would. How could it be any other way? That's a very human thing. And two, it means that muscle is really worked. Like that bicep of negative loop is like strong. It could deadlift 800 pounds, which means we have to build the muscle of looking for hope, looking for
Exactly.
joy, looking for wonder. So when we're in that dark night of the soul place, when we're really deep in our maybe early grief, when we're reeling from a diagnosis or something like that, and we're in our deep suffering, I think we don't even need to begin to think about moving to that place of seeing an AFGO or finding meaning in life. You won't be surprised because you know me well enough to long. There's no formula. There's no amount of time. I'm not going to give you a prescription to say it's a week or a month or a year. Some of the signs we can start to notice is, are we finding ourselves showing up in place after place telling that same negative loop story? Are we ignoring the little moments, the micro joys, as my friend Cindy Spiegel calls them? Are we downplaying these little glimmers that happen because our story is so strong about the suffering, right? So if we're doing that and we hear the echo chamber of kind of our suffering without any reprieve of the over time, and again, this might be weeks, this might be months, it could be days for some people, it depends on your experience, your history. But if you start to notice that, then that might be the time to say, okay, what is it that I can do in my life to work this other muscle of finding maybe gratitude or being of service to somebody else? Because that's actually a really powerful way to get us out of our own suffering and to help us see our common humanity. Or what might I do? And I would say that pivot point, again, is different for everybody. But another important thing to remember is that pivot point, it sounds like you kind of had an aha moment, and maybe some of us do. But for a lot of us, the pivot point is I'm going to pivot towards that and be in it for a while. And then I'm going to hunker back down on the kitchen floor. And then I'm going to pivot back again and I'm going to grow a little more and I'm going to build some more resources. And then an anniversary is going to happen or something's going to happen. I'm going to find myself, so it's not a linear or before and after. It's a slow progression that's going to have hills and valleys or waves or whatever metaphor you want to use. So I think it's just about being tuned in and having people in your life who can be a soft, compassionate mirror for you to check in periodically to say, am I in any way keeping myself stuck in this place by the loops that I'm saying, by the stories that I'm saying, by the things that I'm denying about what's good is happening? And then we're kind of moving forward, but sometimes it's in fits and starts. I think part of why we stay there longer is because we have this idea, this false Hollywood narrative story that we are going to have a aha moment and then we're going to be fine and we're going to go out. And if you're a widow, George Clooney is going to come sweep you up and everything's going to be happily ever after. Right. And so then when it's not happening, then we double down on there's something wrong with us and it's just not meant for us to be happy again. And then we kind of get in that loop. So I think just to name for yourself, like I have a meditation teacher who invites me to call myself sweetie and I just love it. And she would just say like, when you're in that place of the suck, to hold your hand over your heart and say, of course it is, sweetie. How could it be any other way? Of course you're feeling this way now. To start with giving yourself compassion and then have the kind of frank, honest conversation with yourself. And what might I do to participate in my own meaning making journey or finding some growth or healing? But we got to first start with kind of honoring the validity and affirming and holding space for ourselves. So it's that both and, you know,
Mm.
the tattoo, right? Is the both and. It's like be present to your suffering, acknowledge it, and pivot periodically to where's the growth opportunity here? Where are the meaning making? What are the resources that I can draw on to help me metabolize this thing. That's, I think, the problem is for some of us when we get stuck, we're not actually metabolizing what's happening. We're not metabolizing the loss or the suffering. We're just doubling down. And so we can pivot from being with it and then working towards metabolizing it, being with it, metabolizing it. And that's just kind of a hill and valley kind of
Oh,
situation.
yeah, we're going up the stairs and then
Yeah.
up a few, and then we fall down a little, and, my visual when I had that aha moment after, I mean, there were many things that happened. One of them was my coach told me that I was being a victim. There were others, but I had this visual of me swimming around in a kiddie pool of literal like shit or mud. And it was just, I was just swimming around in this kiddie pool being like, I can't get out. I can't get out. And then when she said that, then it was like, oh, I saw how I was choosing to swim in
Yeah.
that
I could
kiddie.
actually just stand up
And I
and
can just stand up, and it's not like, of course, I have mud all over me, and it takes
yeah,
time and
yeah,
effort and everything. It wasn't like a flip of a switch, and the next day I was great. It literally took a year of focused work to really get myself out of
yeah,
depression. But PS, I'm the happiest I've ever been in my life now, a half out of that. And so you can go from the darkest period of your life to the
exactly.
brightest period of your life in a short amount of time. But when I realized that no one was coming to save me, that not that I didn't have friends, that I was the one that was going to have to ask for
Yeah,
help. I was the one that was going to have to reach out. I was the one that was going to have to reprogram my brain, hire a coach, hire a therapist, all of
yeah,
that. That was when I realized that I could just stand up out of that kiddie pool of shit. And the question that you just asked was so profound. You said something to the effect of, where am I keeping myself stuck? And that doesn't take away the validity of feeling pain. But that question that you just asked, we can ask ourselves that not only when we're in a dark night of the soul, but especially that,
yeah,
where am I keeping myself stuck?
yeah. It's a hard question to ask ourselves. And yeah, I'm always qualifying things because I always want to put our suffering too in the context of some of the ways, and this is really the bulk of the work that I do, is some of the ways we suffer unnecessarily. Yes, sometimes are the things that we're doing to keep ourselves stuck, but we don't live in isolation. We live in a broader culture that has systems and isms that reinforce and keep us in those stuck places too. So while I think it is appropriate to figure out where we have agency in our own healing, I think it's important to also both and name the fact that we also live in a culture that's productivity obsessed and happiness obsessed and doesn't allow for mental health parity and all the things, is full of isms, racism and sexism and all the things that add unnecessarily. So given that we swim in this larger pool of culture that doesn't particularly offer us grace for the places when we're suffering. Part of the reason I think that internal question is so powerful is part of where we suffer the most if we've experienced a tragic loss, an assault, a crime, a death, a breakup that wasn't of our own volition, whatever the experience is we lack a sense of agency. And as human beings, that's really triggers our fight or flight, right? Like we are really in threat. And so to ask ourselves a question, where am I keeping myself stuck? Or what resources might I be able to draw on, even if I fumble my way through it in the beginning? That asking the question reminds you that you have some agency, even if it's small, even if it's not going to fix everything. But to be connected to our inner agency is such a powerful tool to just alleviate the unnecessary suffering. Like the things we're going through, the cancer diagnosis, losing my husband so young, and my friend Joe just a few years later at 15 being violated in such a violent and horrific way. Like there's suffering that's going to happen and we want to attend to that. But then there's that unnecessary suffering that happens. And so if we can turn towards ourselves with compassion and care, but invite ourselves to have some agency without excusing what other people did if it was something that people did on purpose to harm you, that's how we start to metabolize and turn towards finding meaning in life while carrying forward the lessons of this hard thing that happened to us, whatever that hard thing is, because
Mhm.
we all have a myriad of hard things.
You bring up such a beautiful point because I think when we are in these challenging places, oftentimes all we want is to get rid of the pain. But that word metabolize that you use is beautiful because it helps me think about productively getting it out as opposed to it just magically going away,
Yeah.
right? Like there's this element of like, how do I metabolize it? Is it through movement? Is it through helping others? Like you said, is a beautiful way to get through suffering. Is it through, work with my
Yeah.
therapist? Is it through, focus
Feeling
what
your
you're saying is
feelings.
the stoic philosophy is focus on what you can control and disregard the rest. You're saying this isn't your fault. This is, but what can I do here in
Yeah.
this moment? So my next question is, as someone who has gone through a lot of suffering and speaks about it so eloquently and so directly and so courageously, I'm curious, what is and you just spoke about how we live in this happiness focused culture. Of course, I think we can all agree on that. But what is the role of suffering in life, in feeling alive?
I think it's all in one. And I think part of the reason we suffer in our suffering is because we've been sort of sold a bill of goods that if you work hard enough or you're smart enough or you follow the 10 steps enough, you're going to live a life without suffering. And so when we do suffer, we don't have any experience of suffering. We think it's a sign of failure or weakness. So we don't really actually have the musculature or the skill set to be with our grief. So I think life and suffering, there isn't a life cycle, whether we're talking about amoebas or animals or plants or people, that doesn't have sort of growth, decay, whatever metaphors you want to think about. Right? So I think our first invitation is to not think about them as separate or think about suffering as a failure of something happening. It's part of life. And then that allows us to see ourselves as part of a bigger system and not to feel so something's wrong with me or woe is me or feel isolated. Because one of the hard things about the hard things in our life, particularly in our culture, is the isolation that we feel.
Mm.
And then I would say, as cliche as it is, I speak from my own experience and from all the hundreds, if not thousands now, of people that I've worked with over the years, is that suffering, the sort of natural experience of suffering or being with the hard feelings, I don't even know if we need to say it's suffering, but whether it's physical pain, emotional pain, psychic pain, right? Attachment wounds from our childhood, whatever those things are, to turn towards them and to really be with them, by the way, because there are the things we can do, see a therapist and move our body, because by the way, we experience our emotions in our body. It's not an intellectual experience, to just be with it, because no emotion ever lasts. The good ones, quote unquote, the ones we want to last, and the hard ones. But the reason they hang around longer is because we sort of try to put them into the corner in a closet and shut the door, but then they linger and fester, right? So if we can be with our suffering, our hard thing, be with the pain, the sorrow, the despair, the anger, all the foreboding joy, whatever it is that's coming up for us, we can find, and this has been my experience, delight and joy and wonder and awe in ways that I don't think you can really grapple or take appreciation for unless you've really turned toward an experience and walked through suffering. I'll give you like a cheesy little example. There's so many more meta and beautiful, more philosophical examples I've had in my life. But this year I went through, as part of my breast cancer treatment, I went through a million different kinds of treatment. And one of them was 12 straight weeks of chemotherapy. So it was just 4 hours in the infusion chair, ice mitts on my hands and feet to prevent neuropathy, having violent allergic reactions to the experience, all kinds of things. It was just an absolute, as you can imagine, hellscape. Or for the listeners who've been through it, I see you. But what would happen, Dave, 4, 5, 6, 7, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, or after every round, one of the many things would happen is I would develop the most vile, metallic taste in my mouth. I literally could not taste salt for 12 weeks. Like I could have licked a salt cube and not tasted it. And nothing tasted like it should be. Everything tasted gross. Not just like neutral, like for people who've had COVID where you couldn't taste anything, because I've had that too. Everything tasted vile.
You're like eating pennies.
I've never experienced anything like that. And nobody had really prepared me for that. Not that I'm sure they could have. So when chemotherapy was done and I had the few weeks break before I started 28 days straight of radiation and my taste buds started to come back, can I just tell you the tears that I cried eating a strawberry?
Strawberry, yes.
There were two things. The strawberry, because I could taste the sweetness of the whole strawberry. But the other one was chips and salsa, because as I told you, I literally couldn't taste salt. which salt we know adds, like that brings out the flavor even in sweet things, right? And I remember for the first time eating like a chip and salsa and being able to really taste the salt and taste all the complex flavors. And I just cried like a little child, temper tantrum cry practically. So that's maybe a silly experience, but had I appreciated chips and salsa before that? I'm going to say no, especially as I lived in Texas for 8 years. It was just everywhere you went, right? So that's an example of we can go through some hard thing or take things for granted, or the physical, like the fact that I couldn't think straight for weeks. And then when I could think clearly again, because chemo brain is much like grief brain and it is really unparalleled. I cannot explain the fog that you go through. And then to think clearly again, or be able to walk more than 2 blocks, or, right? So suffering can offer us an opportunity, again, if we're willing to sort of learn the lessons of it, to appreciate and be in awe and wonder. Dechner Keltner's book, I don't know if you've ever read it, Awe. They did some research around it. And the research came out of a lot of things, including some personal loss that he went through with the death of his brother. But awe and wonder and delight and joy are both the opportunity gift of metabolizing suffering, and it's sort of a double whammy in that tuning to joy and wonder and delight, even in little ways, when we're deep in our suffering, can actually help alleviate the level of our suffering.
Oh,
So
yeah.
it's both like the bonus and the resource, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
And so I really tried to utilize that. Like before I would show up at every chemo appointment this year, not to belabor my cancer treatment, and someone had to drive me because they would drug me up so bad that I couldn't function. I live now in Southern California, and I would go to this overlook right by my place, sometimes driving, even though it was 4 blocks because my energy was so low. And I would just sit and meditate over the ocean and look at the ocean and just really tune into like I had dreamed of living by the ocean my whole life. And of course, I got here and then got cancer. So then life was like, ha ha ha. But to just even spend those 5 minutes before I went to do this hardest thing, I really believe brought me some kind of inner peace and allow me to have a little more grace and be a little more present and to feel a little less suffering because of that intentionality around taking in beauty. I think beauty is one of the most underrated resources that we have in life, and particularly in our suffering and in our
And
grief.
it's abundant.
And it's abundant. I mean,
Underrated, but most abundant. Isn't that
abundant.
how it's like supply and demand? The more we
Yes.
have of something, the
Yeah.
less we appreciate it. Yeah.
Yeah.
But and you speak so beautifully on this notion of finding aliveness in our suffering and in grief. And Byron Katie writes beautifully on it. She, in particular, speaks on how her suffering is what had caused a personal awakening. Like the major awakening, the major turning point in her life was caused by suffering. And we can talk about that with many of us. Myself,
For
absolutely.
sure.
Three
Me
friends,
too.
4 friends
Yeah.
die. You too, also. And that strawberry moment is so simple and so profound because it's those contrasts of life, the challenging moments, which can then give way to the beautiful moments. Imagine you're coasting down the PCH one day and you're in a convertible and the wind is in your hair and the sun's on your face. Right? It's so beautiful. And why is it so beautiful? It's so beautiful because we usually are in some city sitting in traffic. And just like you said, nothing lasts. So when we're in our pain, and that's one of the things that helped get me out of that deep depression in 2020, at the end of 2022, was realizing, oh, this nothing lasts forever. Even though it feels like I'm going to be in this
Yeah.
forever and there's no way I could ever possibly get out, nothing lasts forever. And now that I'm in the happiest moment of my life, one of the happiest moments of my life, I remind myself this won't last either.
Yeah.
The contrast will come and it will teach me the lessons. And as someone who writes about grief and has experienced so much contrast in your own life, the utmost beauty, utmost pain, what awakenings or alive moments has that experienced for you in the moment? Did you have a dark night of the soul that gave way to a beautiful moment? And then also, how has that changed your outlook on feeling alive and beauty and joy in life now?
Great questions. I want to make sure I answered kind of all of them. One of the things that came to me when you were just talking too, I just want to reiterate this point to your listeners too, just to say because I say this throughout my book, I talk about it in the work that I do with individuals and groups, is I think one of the most important prompts that we can remind ourselves, but we have to be intentional about it, is nothing lasts forever, which could lead you to be a nihilist if you weren't being intentional. But nothing lasts forever means when it's hard, there's a reprieve or a grace that you can offer yourself that things will be good. Nothing lasts forever when you're doing well could lead you to foreboding joy, which many of us experience when we've had hard things where we can't quite be present to joy. A slight adjustment to that statement is nothing lasts forever. So I'm going to do everything I can to be present to the beauty in this
Mhm.
moment. Second thing that came to mind as you were describing the wind in your hair, PCH highway, which I don't have wind in my hair anymore since I lost it
Oh,
all. And it's now coming back with the chemo curl, as they call it, is you don't have to wait to the PCH highway. So whether you live in an urban city or you live somewhere, is there like a piece of art in your house that you pass by a million times, but you never really stop to appreciate the colors or the textures? And that practice of cultivating a beauty is really important. When I think about the aliveness question, I always go back to this conversation I had maybe 2 seasons ago on the podcast with a woman whose senior high school son had an accidental overdose and died, a fentanyl overdose. And she spoke so beautifully. I always want to give her credit, Cecily Saraski, that the lesson that she learned from that most profound suffering, where we can think of a parent losing a child, is that she used to think before his death that the continuum of life was between sadness and happiness. But what she discovered in the wake of this profound loss was the continuum that we navigate is between numbness and aliveness. And I think about, I mean, I've thought about that before, but when she said those words to me, talk about sort of chill, full body chills. So I think really about aliveness is about being, it's not about denying or ignoring the hard things or the pain or giving yourself permission to be with it. It's again, exercising that muscle of intentionality about being present to the little joys. If that's all you can find, like I could stand up today, you know what I mean? Whatever that thing is. And that brings us always back again and again to our aliveness. I'm still here. I'm still having this breath. I'm still maybe able bodied. I think a pivot point, I mean, I'm sort of at another pivot point right now, but last year I had, the year before I was actually diagnosed with cancer, which I was misdiagnosed for a year, which was a
Mhm.
similar story to how my husband experience with cancer was as well, my late husband. I went through a tremendously difficult year with a family member who was also in a deep depression and at risk of their life, and sort of got them sort of to a place of stability, helped get them. They got themselves there, accompanied them. And I was just sort of on this precipice of getting ready to give a TED talk and working on my manuscript to turn in my book, which I had gotten a publisher contract. And then 10 days before my manuscript was due to the publisher, I got the diagnosis that I have triple positive breast cancer. And then it had been there all along.
Mm.
What I had found and went from doctor to doctor and was told it's nothing was in fact cancer. So this is maybe 10 days before my book manuscript is due and maybe a month before I'm supposed to take the TED stage to give that talk, TEDx stage. And there was a lesson in there that actually brought me to aliveness. I promise I'm coming around to this aliveness conversation, what it means to be human. Where do we find meaning and belonging, even in the hard things? Is as a professional helper my whole life, right? I, like many of us who are professional helpers, were really good at helping other people and encouraging other people to accept help. And we're pretty shitty, if I might swear again, at
Mhm. Mhm.
receiving, right? Which
Yeah.
is, we can go, this is deep. This goes back to attachment and trauma wounds. And there's lots of reasons. We're not going to unpack that. But the universe, however you want to think about it, had a little message for me because the last chapter that I had to write in this book, full chapter that I hadn't started, I had a few tweaks in those 10 days between diagnosis and it being due, was the chapter that I was writing on why it's important to let people help you. Okay, universe. And so I really made, though everything in my body and my history was like, tell everybody you're fine, you're okay. I live alone
Mm.
now in a new town where I don't really know anybody. I'm fine, it's okay. You don't need, like, I'm strong, I've been through it all. I really made an intentional decision to say yes to every offer of help, which, talk about building a very atrophied muscle. That was like, it took a lot. But I mean, I had 3 different friends who do not have the financial means who took turns flying across the country to take a turn taking me to a chemo appointment again because I couldn't go on my own. I had brand new friends I had just met in this time that I was here in Southern California, like who I barely knew, accompanied me to appointments. Followers on Instagram and social media, like messaged me and said, my daughter knits caps when I lost all my hair and I had sores all over my head. Can she knit you a cap and send it to you? Or blankets. I got so many blankets. I got so much tea, even though, sorry, everybody, I'm not a tea drinker. But what I discovered of the aliveness of that experience was it was such an important reminder that we all need help sometimes. And that the gift I could give the world, in addition to giving myself, is to let myself be helped. And I did it very publicly. I shared my journey on my social media platform, even through my podcast. I talked about the hard days and the good days and the lessons that I learned because it helped other people, give other people permission to receive help because I was walking the walk. But you know what I discovered?
What?
There is an intimacy and a sense of belonging that is so powerful when you're vulnerable enough to receive help. I really thought I was going to feel isolated from people and embarrassed and that I was going to feel even more alone, which I would already like, there was nobody here in the middle of the night when stuff went down. The dog was not really capable of helping me with the things I need, though she's cute. And so I really thought accepting help and sort of humbling myself in this way was going to make me feel so much more alone and so much more needy and opposite of aliveness, like that it was going to make me feel a burden. And not that I didn't have those moments because I have old tapes that like to play on loop in my head. But I will tell you, I will never forget this lesson as long as I get to live. What beauty of connection and belonging and aliveness I felt allowing myself to receive help. These little, some big and some little gestures of help was so powerful. So my friends recently been like, can you believe just 6 months ago, you weren't sleeping for days at a time because you had sores all over your head and you didn't have hair or eyelashes or eyebrows. And now I'm about to embark on a 10-city book tour for my book. And I'm well enough to do it with this. So also allowing people to be a mirror to you. All of those things I think really draw me into my aliveness, because to be present to your aliveness means being present for one thing, like in the present moment. But it also is such a powerful invitation to be connected to the fact that our aliveness is intimately interconnected to the aliveness of every species and being around us. So I will have more challenges in my life should I get to live a long life, because we all will. This is one in this season of my life that I'm really being present to. Is like, I could go on this book tour, and if only 2 people show up at the bookstore event, or I don't make the New York Times bestseller list or whatever, I could just be present to like the things that I don't have. Oh, that's embarrassing. I only had 2 people show up at the bookstore, or whatever the thing is, right? I'm healthy and well enough and have a book, which was a dream come true in the world. I get to go to all of these cities. I get to, at the very least, be in conversation with a fellow author who I admire and love. And I get to explore some of them new cities I've never been to.
Amazing.
All gravy, right? Am I going to have hard times? Do I experience a lot of pain because of all of the, I'm still going to be on pills, and there's a lot of complications from going through treatment. That's going to be there too. And I'm going to have to pace myself. But I'm really working on flexing that muscle and continuing to build that muscle of aliveness, of wonder, of awe, of being in the present, and using we share this in common, all of the mindfulness tools that I have garnered and practiced over time to draw my attention out of the past and out of the future and back into where we started today, which is arriving in alignment with bringing intention to my attention.
My
Yeah.
gosh. So receiving help can be so difficult. And yet many of us feel so, like you said, isolated and alone. And I think a lot of us have, as you said, this atrophied muscle of receiving help. And I think it's important to note here that one does not have to have cancer
Yeah.
in order to work that muscle and grow that muscle of receiving help, because a lot of us receive offers for help and favors all the time that, oh, no, I'm fine. I'm okay.
Yeah.
Everything's fine. And in our culture, we have commodified and capitalized a lot of the help that we used to be able to get from other people, right? Like,
Right.
oh, someone to bring you soup. Well, now I can DoorDash it. Someone to do XYZ. Like now we can get everything to our door paid for.
But
But
there's
in
no
that,
intimacy there. There's
the
no
intimacy
connection
and the
there.
humanity and the community, which is what we so desire and is what leads us to a fully satisfied life and feeling alive, is in that community. And so I think what we can take away from this is just keeping our eyes aware of when we're saying, oh no, I'm fine, and we're
Yeah.
not giving people the opportunity to help us, because a lot of us want to live a good life, to be,
Yeah.
grossly general, but we want to give people, we want to be remembered well. We want to be remembered as loving and kind. But have you ever offered to help someone with something and they say, "Oh, I'm fine." You sort of feel like you hit a wall,
Yeah.
or
There's a
it's a cold
disconnect.
experience. And
Yeah.
so, to receive those offers and to say, "Yes, oh, I will allow you to be helped." You're actually giving a gift to that person, and you're creating a bond that will last probably a
Yeah.
lifetime and a memory. And so it's not just when we're receiving help, we're not just receiving, we're also giving.
We're allowing that person who cares about us, even if it's maybe an acquaintance, to feel of service, which is good for their well being too. It creates an intimacy. And it also does a third thing for this other person when we say yes. And again, we have to be judicious, right? We're not going to say yes to every offer of support. And sometimes the help people offer isn't helpful. So it's okay to say no.
Mhm, yeah.
But the other thing we're doing, and I really felt this because I am a semi public figure, whatever that means, just because people know me from my talks and my podcast and work, is when I was very public about the receiving help that I was receiving, I'm also giving people permission to receive help in their own hard thing. Because if you work at a place and they say you can take time off whenever you want, but nobody in senior management ever takes time off, then you start to understand that to be a good person or to be a good employee, as an example, in a workplace culture, is to not take time off. So if the people you admire, the people in your life never show you that they are struggling or suffering in some way and
Mhm.
accept help, then we internalize the lesson that it's not okay for me to have needs and for me to receive help. So by doing it and maybe doing it publicly in whatever form that means for you, I think we're gifting people something really powerful. That is a really sort of explicit lesson in the beauty that comes from receiving. They always say put on your own oxygen mask before assisting others, but sometimes you're the other and sometimes you're the person putting on like we all take turns. I
Mm.
use the metaphor of diving in my book, and that chapter is called why, like when breathing is necessary, which I learned from my early time as a scuba diver at age 12. And sometimes we're the one who has the air, and sometimes we're the ones who are needing the air. And it's okay to navigate. And in fact, when we receive help, this is another lesson that I'm remembering that I shared in the book that I think I hope is an aha to some people, is the additional benefit of receiving help with some modicum of grace, right?
Yeah.
Is that we learn what help feels like and what help is helpful. So the next time that we are out there trying to offer help to somebody, we have a more lived experience of not, and now the things that helped you in this one place didn't help them, but you start to understand, what does it feel like to be the receiver of help? What are the barriers people put in their place? What might I say to that person to help ease their resistance to receiving help? Because you've lived it yourself. I mean, think about all our most powerful teachers in the world. They are the people who've walked the walk,
Mhm.
you
Absolutely.
know?
So I see that beauty in receiving and how that actually can create these positive ripples, right? Like I said, we want to leave these positive ripples. And so we think we need to write a book or start a nonprofit, and sure, do those things,
Yeah.
but don't also overlook our opportunity in receiving help, in giving help, in sharing our story to the level that we're comfortable with in our suffering, that those are profound ripples that can go far beyond that
Yes.
which we ever can comprehend. And there were many reasons why I wanted to have you on my show to talk about being alive. Part of it is the suffering that you've gone through, right? And I
Yeah.
believe that suffering is a part of all lives and it also
Yes.
is a path to feeling alive. In my master's program, I'm studying transpersonal psychology, which is the feeling of being alive, right? Our mystical
Yeah.
experiences. And there's a lot of ways to have a mystical experience. One of them is you can take psychedelics, you can
Yeah.
meditate, you can do breath work, you can, you know, and also you can have suffering, and suffering can be that path
Yeah.
to profound mystical peak experiences. Another reason why I wanted to have you on the show is because I believe profoundly that self expression is absolutely required to living a good life and
Yeah.
also feeling alive. What a shame for us to get to the end of life and realize that we hid our whole lives behind masks. We didn't get the chance to know who we are this go round and experiment with that. And you, I perceive as a person who you just stand in your power really well. And I even contrast that with myself, right? Like I wrote a book called You Might Die Tomorrow, started the brand, all of that. And You Might Die Tomorrow. I've gotten a lot of heat for it along over the years because it is a very polarizing, provocative, triggering statement. You might die tomorrow. That really it hits a lot of people. It can
Yeah.
also be really inspiring and profound. But
Mm.
the reason that I bring it up for you is because you're the title of your show and now your book that's coming out, and I want to hear more about that, is Grief is a Sneaky Bitch. And that is very direct. And you put yourself out there and you have this beautiful balance of direct, take no shit, and also compassion. And so I'd love to hear about where that courage comes from. What has your evolution been with the courage to be yourself and the courage to put yourself out there and the courage to have a title of your book, Grief is a Sneaky Bitch, knowing that will piss some people off and the
Mhm.
courage to be provocative.
Yeah. It's funny about that title. So, Grief is a Sneaky Bitch, which I started my podcast 5 years ago now, came from an experience I had. A title was, which I said that out loud maybe a year or two after I was at a party for the first time after my husband died with mostly all new people. But the host was a new great friend who had experienced profound loss too. So I knew she'd get it. And I reached into my purse and found a printed out picture of Eric, my late husband, which I'd never carried around. Like, I still don't to this day know how that picture got in the purse. And in the middle of like 30, I don't know, 20, 30 strangers, I pulled out the picture, saw his picture, and burst into tears. And she sort of pulled me aside and I said, God damn, grief is such a sneaky bitch. That's where it came from. But part of the reason that the courage to even, and this was, I created I didn't know anything about podcasting 5 years ago. I had been a clinical social worker. Like, what do we, I'm like Googling, how do you record a podcast? Is I wanted that title because I don't know that I could say I had the foresight of the courage, but it felt so true. And everybody I told about it nodded. And I got a lot of, definitely some people were like, well, it's not going to, like, I can't pay to advertise, by the way, like on Facebook or Instagram because of that title, et cetera. But I felt like part of my work as a grief activist to really call all of us to task on our grief illiteracy and the harm that we cause ourselves and others by keeping these grief myths going and being grief illiterate is we need to get people's attention. And that title did. And it took a lot for me because I was like, can I do this? I'm a widow, but I'm a social worker, but can I just go out here and have this title? And what are guests going to think when I invite them onto the show? Are they going to be resistant? Honestly, in 5 years, I've had rabbis on my show. One of them who was like, this is the best title of any
Yes.
podcast
Love that,
ever,
Rabbi.
has ever happened, or philosophers and death doula. Like, I've had, of course, all kinds of guests on my show over the years, artists, filmmakers, CEOs, et cetera, a lot of authors. It just really resonated. And I knew to be a real change maker, which is really how I think about my work in grief activism, I have to tell it straight. Having said that, I hope that the art that I weave is all of my training as a narrative therapist and just how I show up in the world is a profound consumer of philosophy, metaphor, poetry. I think Parker Palmer, but I don't know who said it originally. I don't think it was Parker Palmer, but metaphor is truth told slant. And there are some hard truths that we need to grapple with that we can't have straightforward language. So I think I'd like to think about myself as being both honest and direct and maybe having cheeky titles and metaphors and sayings like AFGO and grief is a sneaky bitch. But I also am really intentional of when I use that. I'm really intentional about when I bring metaphor to bear, which this book is like chock full of metaphor, because these things that our soul isn't ready to hear right away, we need a soft entry point to them. And then I would say I combine that with sort of a third thing, which has been the lesson that I learned when I didn't receive it early on, which turned out to be the sustained meditation I've been on for decades now, is really around holding space and bearing witness. So how do we be direct and name things are as a permission giving to people? And that's how I think about the work that I do, while also offering people a way in through metaphor and language and experience. And how do I start? By first holding space and bearing witness. So much of our culture is like, you got a problem, I'm going to diagnose you, I'm going to give you pills, I'm going to give you treatment, we're going to go. And nobody stops first to say, like, I see you, I hear you, and I'm holding you in my heart. That's how I've signed off for 5 years. And that's the approach that I take. So all of those things combined, I don't know if I could say I have the courage. I did some public facing work before I became a grief activist and before I did this, because I co-founded a nonprofit. So I did a lot of TV and radio to try to bring awareness to that, ironically, cancer nonprofit years ago. I didn't know how else to be. I recognize the ways in which we've tiptoed around grief and we've tried to decide that it's something that is hidden in the corner. I just could see it and had lived it. So much unnecessary harm that I knew that I wasn't going to just like tiptoe quietly into this work. And the unique thing that I think that I gave myself permission to be a little more brave and a little more out is, having been served as a more clinical social worker with a licensure and all of that, I had some real parameters around self-disclosure, which totally appropriately. And there was a little more boundary between me and the world and my clients or my community. And when I started Grief is a Sneaky Bitch, the podcast, and all of my work at Reimagining Grief as a grief activist in workplaces, as a speaker with individuals, et cetera, I decided with intentionality, I am not bringing my licensure with me. I'm going to bring all the wisdom that I learned as a social worker, as a narrative therapist, working in public housing and foster care and adoption and crisis intervention and cancer, like all the places I've been. But I was also going to bring my human experience as a rape survivor and as a widow and as someone who had the death of a friend, now someone who's experienced cancer. So I think that also is what has given me the chance to really show up in my full humanity, in the messiness of all that this is, because we learn, as I said before, from people not talking the talk, but walking the walk. And so I knew I needed to both kind of shock and awe with the title, but also to show up in my full humanity with a real deep compassion that holding space and bearing witness is how I try to live every day of my life. And I try to do it through my work. And you can't do that and be closed off.
Mm-hmm.
You can't do that and be like perfect, and just have this barrier in this. By the way, not that I don't have boundaries. My clients aren't my friends. Like I do have boundaries in the different work that I do. And I really am trying to show up as my full self and that in doing that, again, I'm giving other people permission to name the messy parts of their lives, to show up in their full humanity, to learn from my story, but also use their story to teach somebody else something that they're going through and so on and so forth. So that's how I sort of, this is the most public role I've ever been in, but I sort of, when I made the major shift to do this work specifically, I didn't see any other way to do it. Like it didn't even, I don't know what this all would have looked like if I had tried to show up like with my social worker hat on
Mm-hmm.
only.
And maybe that's part of it. Maybe you didn't allow yourself to overthink it. You went with your intuition. And as a person that's gone through a lot of suffering, you have this perspective of now is the time.
Yes.
This is me. Come as I am. And not only your life experience, but as a trained clinical social worker as well,
Yeah.
that, yeah, you didn't overthink it. And I think that's where, we all go through overthinking and
Oh,
analysis paralysis, right? But to develop, again, we're talking a lot today. I'm observing about developing these muscles. With the muscle of, we're always going to have some level of negative thinking, but developing our muscle of a positive mindset and outlook, and that tendency that we have to be negative with positive. And honestly, I'm at a path right now where I'm like, we have to be delusional. Like
Yeah.
you to
Yeah.
survive in this world and to be at the level of happiness that I am right now, I have like 30% delusional, right?
Yeah.
And being delusional is so amazing because if I just look at like what's real or like abject reality, it's can be really depressing. We also
Yeah.
talked about building the muscle of receiving as
Yeah.
well as giving and how that is a muscle that we can build. And now we talk about building the muscle of being ourselves, of not overthinking. And it's
Yeah.
just a process. You say it so beautifully every time. You know, you do qualify, but you qualify because we're human and you don't want it to seem like we're flicking a switch in these areas, that it is a
No.
process.
And
And
sometimes I've stumbled and maybe I've overshared and then I learned, ooh, that wasn't appropriate. And then I've calibrated it. I've made amends where I needed to. Like, I just, I think the more we can build this muscle and be courageous enough to be public about the messy journey we're on, with being mindful that we're not trying to intentionally hurt people and try to reduce the harm where we go. I think that's just like the most needed medicine in this world of prescriptive 10 to-do list. You get to a perfect place and everything is neat and orderly. It's like that isn't right. So to just build that
boring.
muscle, boring, and just like, yeah. Well, it's not only boring. I actually can just kind of maybe full circle that. I think that comes back to where we experience not the suffering that is part of life, but that layer of unnecessary suffering. I had palliative Dr. BJ Miller on my show years ago, and that was our whole conversation was around unnecessary suffering. Part of where we suffer unnecessarily, where we atrophy those muscles of kind of being in the world in ways that are authentic, is that we are so locked into the myths of the linearness and of the possibility of neatness and the orderliness and the perfection that our own messy lived experience, we tell ourselves the story is a failure. And so that hard thing becomes even more harder because we're not willing to ask for help because it doesn't look like how other people are doing it, because we think there's something inherently wrong with our messy journey, when in fact, everybody's journey is messy. And that's where, if we more of us build our muscle and told the truth of the messiness of our lives and shared, here's what worked for me, this resource or that resource might not work for you, then we could take down that unnecessary suffering and feel part of a community. You
Mm,
know, when you've met that friend and you're like same girl, same, because you shared your hard thing and the messiness, right? Think about the intimacy and the sense of belonging that we could cultivate if we didn't have that kind of pedestal or us them kind of way of seeing the world. I think it's really powerful.
life is a process of, I think, self expression and know thyself, right? Know
Yeah.
thyself. I think that it's a process of creation and absolutely it's a process of destruction. We have to create, we have to experiment, right? But we also have to destroy. We also have to systematically be on this path of figuring out who am I and who am I not. That involves taking away masks, lies, delusion, self doubt, imposter syndrome. And it's a process, it's a path that we'll be on for the whole of our lives. I don't think we'll ever truly figure it out, but to be committed to being on that path for the whole of our lives.
Yeah.
Oh, it's so beautiful. And I
It's
see
so
you on
beautiful.
that path. You're just so committed to learning and sharing and figuring it out. And like you said, walking the walk. And isn't there such a beautiful aliveness in that?
That's what I was about to say. Like this never ending learning and this growth that I think is part of the human experience and that can bring us some aliveness isn't about like, I'm not okay now. But when I get to some higher enlightened state, I'm going to be okay. The path is being present to the version of you that you are now, loving the parts of you and the ways in which you're showing up in the world that you want to hold on to, but being willing to also release the parts of you or the ways in which you're showing up in the world that is causing others or you unnecessary harm. But all of that aliveness and all of that sort of ever evolving learning isn't meant to, is actually an invitation to be very present and
Oh,
not
yeah.
to sort of put off like, okay, well, when I get there or there or there, then
There ain't no there, honey. We here.
right, we here. We don't know where there is. And we don't know if there's going to be what we think it's going to be. So coming back to that present learning and doing the both and of appreciating what is while also recognizing what we want to set down. I mean, for some of us, I mean, it's a lifetime task, but to break it down, it's just can be hour to hour, minute to minute. It's
Yep.
this conversation even.
Here right now. Absolutely. Well,
Yeah.
show us, can you show your book?
Mhm, yes.
So if you're listening It's called Grief is a Sneaky Bitch. It's colorful, it's vibrant, just like Lisa herself. And the tagline is an uncensored guide to navigating
Wow.
loss.
Yeah.
Thank you for writing it. Thank you for the
Oh,
courage of doing it at the end of your cancer diagnosis. And so this is truly a labor of passion and love. And like, you're going through the roof. You just have such
thank you.
amazing gifts that you share with all of us. What do we need to know about the book?
The book will be in bookstores June 4th, but it is available for pre-order now on bookshop.org and amazon.com and friendsandnoble.com. Sign up for my not so regular newsletter, which is just lisakeefauver.com/newsletter, and or to follow me at Lisa Keefauver MSW, which stands for Masters of Social Work. Lisa Keefauver MSW on whatever social you like to hang out on. I am there. And then you can find out about the book. You can listen to the 90 free hours of podcast episodes. And maybe I would love, just as we close in, but about the book, talk about being present to the gifts. I was just talking about this with my friend who's sort of my creative coach and consultant, such a wise person. The best part of writing this book is that I get to go out in the world and be in conversation and hold space with so many people who maybe have been listeners to the show over the years, some of which I've maybe met through my one-on-one work or my trainings or my workshop, or people I've never met before or just learning about me now. But the best part of this whole book is the opportunity to be in intimate conversation with grievers across the country. Like this is the gravy on top of it all. It's the people, and being really present and being with the people has always been really important to me, given the isolation I had to be in this year, given my immunocompromised state and all the things. I'm especially grateful for
Reveling
this.
in it.
I mean, I'm just going to revel in I'm just receiving this time to be in community with people, IRL, as the kids say.
Well, amazing work on the book, June 4th, Grief is a Sneaky Bitch. Congratulations and amazing work on going through the incredible journey of surviving and thriving cancer. Thank you for coming and sharing a bit of your wisdom today. You have so much more to share. So, everyone, please go follow Lisa. And as we close, you tell me about a moment recently that you felt profoundly alive.
I took a hip hop cardio dance class recently.
Oh, yes.
And dance used to be something I did all through high school and college, and I couldn't move. I did yoga and other things this year. And my commitment this year as I move into Thriving Place is to have fun. Someone asked me earlier last year, what do you do for fun? And I realized I really didn't have an answer. And now that I feel well-ish enough, again, aches and pains related to all of the treatment, but I just found myself a little cardio hip hop dance class and just went and just danced it out. And I just felt so alive. I am really committed to finding fun. So that's the last time. That was Tuesday, just a couple days ago.
Out of the comfort zone, maybe feeling a little that
Totally. And
heart
didn't
out
give a crap what
body.
anybody else in the room thought about my moves.
Woo!
And I was sweating and all the things. Cancer treatment is hair change and weight gain, and didn't care. I just was really present
Right, world.
to my body, being able to move in ways that I wanted to and to be in rhythm and sync to the music. And it was just like pure, total bliss.
She alive. She's alive
You're
and kicking
alive.
and she's
Yeah.
here to tell the story.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Lots of love to you.
Oh, lots of love to you. Thank you so much for this work, for our friendship, for everything.
Hey, y'all. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you are watching this, I have the camera down so that you can see Pajamas right here. She's just snoozing away. I'm here with Pajamas to say thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being here and being part of this community. It is just an absolute honor to bring this show to you. I know that when I create these episodes for you, I am having so much fun and I get such a jazz out of bringing this content to you and just sharing my life with you along the way. So please, if you could, whether you're watching this or listening, leave a comment, do a subscribe, and share this with a friend. Be like, hey, there's this woman, Kate, and she calls herself an inspirer, and I think you might like her stuff too. I'd love to continue to grow this community and continue to bring even more amazing podcasts and stories to you. With all my love from Kate and pajamas. Bye.